Thank you all for joining us this afternoon or morning, whatever time of day it may be for you. My name is Claire Desoy. I'm the Communications Director for the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to our webinar on the 2024 Survey of the Performance of American Elections. We are going to be recording this webinar, and we will be posting it on our website. So if you want to come back and see any part of it, or if you want to direct other folks to it, it will be available. And we will have some time for Q&A at the end. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see that there's a little Q&A, little question mark in a chat bubble. So if you do have questions, you can submit them at any point and we'll get to them at the end. Without further ado, I will pass things off to Charles Stewart, who is our founding director, to take things away.
Great. Thanks a lot, Claire. And again, welcome to everybody who's on the webinar today. As Claire mentioned, I'm Charles Stewart. I'm the Keenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science here at MIT and the Director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully not demonstrate that after 5 years of intensive Zoom meetings, I still can't do this. I'll count on Claire to tell me if I've done this wrong. So again, today I'm going to be talking through the 2024 survey of the performance of American elections. My agenda is to say a few words about the Election Lab for those who aren't familiar with our work, and then talk about the SPAE, its background a little bit, and then jump into the highlights of some of the findings from 2024. And the topics that I'll talk about when we get to the highlights will be discussing the voter experience, transition away from election day voting, which has been ongoing for now several federal elections, the issue of voter confidence, voter IDs, and then security measures employed by state and local officials. And then I'll end my presentation by talking about how to assess the data, how to use it. So very quickly on the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, I assume most people on the call are familiar with us. We were founded in 2017. The core of our activity is to collect, analyze, and share election data to support both academic and non-academic research. And then also, just as important, is that we work to build relationships with election officials and other practitioners to help apply scientific research to the practice of democracy in the US. We are nonpartisan, we are scientific, we are, as you would imagine from MIT, a little bit geeky, and that's the lane that we like to travel in, and we think is an important lane to maintain. I encourage you to go to our website to find out more about our work. You can go to electionlab.mit.edu. There's a lot of stuff there, including the splash page, which will lead you to the report about the 2024 SPAE. I'd also encourage you to go to the section on projects, which will highlight a number of things that we've done. Recently, we've been engaged in an agenda setting exercise to try to encourage greater translation of research and election science into election administration, and have worked with UC San Diego on a project to do research into building techniques to communicate better about what election officials do so that ultimately greater trust in the system can be developed. We also publish every 2 years the Elections Performance Index. If you want to see how things were up to 2022, I encourage you to go to elections.mit.edu. The lab is currently hard at work to pull together the data from 2024, and we anticipate releasing the updated EPI sometime probably in January of 2026, right as the 2026 election season is getting going. So let's jump right into the SPAE, and I'll begin by talking about the background. This is the 7th national study. There were a few pilots before the SPAE launched in 2008. But we've been in the field every presidential election since 2008 and most midterm congressional elections as well. So this is the 7th time we've done the study. The study is built around sampling 200 respondents. These are registered voters in every state plus the District of Columbia, which gives us 10,200 respondents overall. One of the features of this sampling strategy is to allow us to dive into the dynamics in not only the large states where we usually get a lot of respondents in national surveys, but also small states. So Delaware and Wyoming, we can talk about them just as well as we can talk about California and Texas. The survey is an internet survey conducted by YouGov. It goes into the field the day after Election Day and is in the field for a couple of weeks after that. The survey has been supported by a number of foundations over the years. It was originally supported by the Pew Charitable Trusts and then the Democracy Fund. And this time it was supported through the good graces of the Elections Trust Initiative. The survey is organized around some core questions related to why the respondents, if they didn't vote, why they didn't vote. And then for those who did vote, their experience when they went to vote, whether it was in person or by mail. And then attitudes about fraud, attitudes about reform. And then we always delve into special topics related that are kind of topical for that particular election. And in 2024, we asked a series of questions about knowledge of the security features of elections as conducted by the states and localities, voter ID, and any experience that the respondents had observing disruptions at the polls. Overall, there are 166 items on this survey. I am not going to discuss all 166 of them, but we'll kind of skim some of the highlights, things I think the audience might be interested in. So let's get into the highlights, and we'll talk about the voter experience. As I mentioned, the core of the questions in the SPAE are about the experience of voters when they went to the polls on Election Day, or when they voted by mail, or when they voted early. And indeed, the inspiration for the SPAE originally was an observation made by many people in the aughts following the Florida recount that things weren't going well for voters. And so this survey started as a check on that, reality check. What's the experience of voters when they go to cast a ballot? And as with all of the prior years, the responses in 2024 were the same as in the past. So for instance, when we ask people about how easy it was to find their polling place, 97% of Election Day voters said it was very easy or fairly easy to find their polling place. When we asked them whether they had a problem with voter registration when they got to the polls, 98% said no. When they went to cast their ballots, 98% of both Election Day and early voters reported no problems in casting those ballots. That a similar percentage said that things were run either very well or okay in the polling place that they visited, and that 97% of in-person voters said that the poll workers they encountered performed excellently or performed well. One of the features of the experience that varies more over time has to do with how long people wait to vote. This was a big issue in 2012, and in fact became the precipitating issue of the 2013 Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And if we look at the time line here, we see that in 2024, about 15% of Election Day voters and 11% of early voters, 15% of early voters and 11% of Election Day voters waited more than 30 minutes to cast their ballot. This 30-minute benchmark was set by the President's Commission, which stated that no voters should have to wait more than 30 minutes to vote. And we can see that in 2020, or rather in 2016, those numbers went down, in large part because election officials tried to get those lines shorter. Went up in 2020 in all of the changes that happened in 2020, and fell in 2024, but not back to 2016 levels, which suggests there may be some work to be done yet again in order to get those lines down to the 2016 levels. So a lot of information in the SPAE about the experience. One topic that's been of particular interest starting in 2020 was voting by mail and in general, the transition away from election day voting. Now, if we start with the experience of voters who voted by mail, again, the experience of those voters in the survey was a very positive one. Almost everyone said it was easy to get their ballot. They did not have a problem with marking their ballot, and that overall it was easy to engage in voting by mail. But to step back into the larger trends, I'm showing here a graph that relies not on the SPAE, but on the Census Bureau's current population survey, the voting and registration supplement, so that we can get a longer time series. We see that over the last couple of decades, there's been a steady decline in the percentage of voters who vote on election day. And up until 2016, there was a steady increase of voters who voted by mail or early. 2020 interrupted that, of course, where there was a huge shift. And for the first time ever, voting by mail was the most common way of voting. But in 2022 and 2024, much of that reconfiguration of voting modes returned not to 2016, but more closely or more accurately, return to the long range trend that we saw coming up to in the 20 years coming up to 2016. So in 2024, about 40% of voters voted on election day, and roughly 30% voted either early or by mail. Now, one of the issues that's come up in voting by mail is the use of drop boxes, because many people like to receive their ballots by mail, but they don't necessarily like to send the ballot back by mail. And there's been a lot of legislative activity around drop boxes. One of the things that we ask for people who receive their ballot by mail is how they returned their ballots. And we can see in this graph that despite the legislative activity in many states to restrict the use of drop boxes, that roughly the same percentage of people mailed back their ballot in 2024 as did in 20, and roughly the same percentage used drop boxes as they did in 2020. Another issue that's come up in the administration of voting by mail, of course, has been this divide between Democrats and Republicans in voting by mail. And these two graphs show the percentage of Democrats and Republicans in the SPAE who reported that they voted by mail or voted early in person. And we can see on the left that in 2020, the percentage of Democrats who reported they voted by mail skyrocketed up to 60%, and they fell back down to about 37% in 2024. The percentage also rose among Republicans, but not as dramatically in 2020, and returned to roughly pre-pandemic levels in 24. Interestingly, and this has been less remarked, I think, in research and commentary, but parallel these shifts in voting by mail has been shifts in voting early in person. And while there's been this kind of shifting around of Democrats and Republicans voting by mail, there's also been a bit of a shift in Republicans and Democrats voting early, where now Republicans, a big gap has grown between Republicans and Democrats in the use of early in-person voting. Interestingly enough, before the pandemic, that gap was reversed, with Democrats being more likely to vote early in person. Another thing that I found interesting in looking at the data is not only the partisan divide in the use of mail ballots, but in the attitudinal shift in the use of mail ballots. One of the questions we ask, and we've been asking since 2018, is whether respondents favor conducting elections entirely by mail. And this next graph, what I've done is I've reported the percentage of respondents for each of these presidential years who've responded that they favor running elections by mail. The first panel shows respondents from what I would call the legacy vote by mail states, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. The middle panel are those states that instituted voting by mail in 2020, and most of them have remained vote by mail states in 24. And then the final panel is all the other states. There's a lot to reflect on these three panels. The thing I would point out is that in the legacy states, coming up into before the pandemic, Republicans were less supportive of vote by mail than Democrats were, but nonetheless, Republicans and Democrats were becoming more supportive. In 2020, Republicans in these states ceased to be supportive of voting by mail, and they became like Republicans in other states. And that skepticism about voting by mail remains in those three states. Now, those three states are predominantly Democratic states. The state governments are run by Democrats. It's unlikely there's going to be policy consequences soon about this shift in public opinion in these states, but it is something that bears watching in the legacy states, as well as in the states such as California, Utah, and Vermont, where vote by mail has become more common more recently. Now, turning our attention to voter confidence, another topic that's a lot of people have been interested in over the last several years. The SPAE has been asking this basic question from the beginning: how confident are you that votes insert level here were counted as intended? And the levels we ask about are your own vote, votes in your county or city, votes at the state level, and votes nationwide. And we allow the respondents to respond on this 4-point scale, ranging from very confident to not at all confident. Now, if we just look at the results from 2024 across these 4 different levels, we see what we typically see in an election year. First of all, very high levels of confidence if we combine those 2 categories, very and somewhat confident. 96% of respondents were confident at some level that their own vote was counted as cast, and 83% of respondents were confident to some degree that votes nationwide were counted as intended. And as you move further away from your own vote to the nation, people become less confident. Nonetheless, on the whole, most voters at most levels express some degree of confidence. Now, I know many people watching this webinar will think, well, that's kind of weird, because we know there's a lot of folks out there who aren't always confident. And yes, that's right. And we can see that when we begin to, excuse me, I'll start here and go to the next slide. When we start to break down these numbers across time and then by party. So the pattern I just showed you of greater confidence regarding your own vote, the least confidence nationwide, this ordering has been pretty stable over the last decade or so. What has really varied, though, of course, has been how these numbers move by party. We observe, first of all, in general, what's been called the winner-loser effect, that co-partisans of the winning party for president tend to be more confident, the losing party tending to be less confident. But another important pattern here is that Republicans have shown themselves to be more variable in how they react to the winner and loser effect. Also, in some research that I've been doing with one of the PhDs here at MIT, Joe Lafredo, we also discover that confidence in elections at the state level Republicans are much more attuned to things like legislation, counting speed, and closeness of the vote in the state than are Democrats. And so Democrats and Republicans really are different, not only in their levels of confidence, but also in the degree to which just thinking about how well elections are being run, how salient is that question? For Republicans, it seems to be much more salient than to Democrats. Moving on, one of the special topics we investigated this year had to do with photo IDs. This is a question we had regularly set of questions we had regularly asked until 2016. And in 2020, the issue of voter ID didn't seem to be quite as important. There were other things we wanted to ask about. We dropped these questions, but the question about voter ID has heated up a bit. There's a number of states, Nevada, Michigan, North Carolina, California, Maine, Wisconsin, where in recent years, either upcoming elections or past elections, legislative sessions, proposals to institute photo ID requirements have come back onto the agenda, and many states that already had photo ID requirements have been tightening them up. So we returned our battery of questions about the possession, the presentation, and attitudes about photo IDs very quickly. First of all, the possession of IDs, two most common forms of ID possessed by respondents are driver's licenses and passports. We see that the percentage of respondents saying they have a driver's license is up to near 100% compared to 89% in 2016. And the percentage reporting that they have a passport has also risen a bit since 2016. We also ask about whether people hold a whole bunch of other forms of identification, such as voter registration cards, state government IDs, and those sorts of things, and whether those IDs have a picture or don't have a picture. And as you can see, a lot of people report, about half the respondents report they have a voter registration card. Very small percentage of people say they have, for instance, an out-of-state public university or college ID card. One of the things to note, and if you have a sharp eye, you'll note that about 10% of respondents claim that they have a voter ID card with their picture on it, which is possible because as far as I know, no state has a voter registration card with a picture on it. And so that answer, as well as the answers to the other questions, point out that we do need to be very mindful of certain types of reporting bias in these questions. I think they are more reliable as we observe the numbers across time, and we need to take these numbers with a bit of a grain of salt in any given slice in time. The other thing that we ask voters is when they went to vote in person, were they asked to show a photo ID? And then among those who said that they were asked to show a photo ID, we asked them first, did they show an ID to vote? And then for those who said, yes, I showed a photo ID, we asked, well, were you required to show one, or did you do so because it was convenient? And these two graphs summarize the answers to these questions. A couple of things I find interesting. First of all, as in the past, between a quarter and a third of people who live in so-called HAVA minimum states, these are the states that only require you to state your name and address when you show up, and you don't have to show ID. Roughly a quarter to a third report they still showed an ID. However, when we asked them if they were required, only about 10% of that 28% said that they were required to show a photo ID. On the other hand, the great majority of people in ID required states report they showed a photo ID, but when we asked them if they were required to show one, only about half say that they were required. So these answers together just raises the questions about the actual interactions that are going on in polling places. And there have been a number of studies over the years actually commenting on this. On the one hand, many voters just not really thinking about showing ID regardless of what the requirements are at the state level. And on the other hand, and sometimes in the HAVA minimum states, sometimes poll workers will insist on instituting a photo ID requirement even when it doesn't. It's not required. The last thing I will just note, looking at the public opinion question that we ask about photo ID, is that really I believe for the first time, majorities of Democrats support a requirement to show a photo ID in order to vote. Republicans have been near unanimous for the last few elections, and all voters has been around 80%. We break this down in the report by state and note that in every state now, a majority of the respondents in this survey said that they support requiring a photo ID to vote. And in all but 5 states, Democrats have majority support for showing a photo ID. And again, the actual politics of whether those attitudes lead to actual photo ID requirements will be, complicated in various states. But I do know that there's a number of citizen initiatives in Democratic states that don't require photo ID, but in which, by our measures, a majority of Democratic voters even say they support voter ID. So it'll be interesting to watch the dynamics in these states as the campaigns in favor of photo ID requirements play out. The last topic that I just want to mention has to do with questions of election security. In the last couple of elections, we have adopted some questions that were first asked in Colorado in a project by their state election department. We asked respondents if they were, first of all, aware of whether their state or locality engaged in a variety of security practices to secure the elections. And then the second question was whether or not your state does this, would you be reassured of the security of elections if it did? So the first thing just to note here are the dozen or so things we ask about. The labels, for instance, logic and accuracy testing are just the labels that we've used for the graph. We try to describe in a sentence what each of these items is. So for instance, for logic and accuracy testing, we describe that as testing voting machines before the elections to ensure that they accurately reflect the votes cast on the machine, things like that. And we see that less than 40% of respondents said that they were aware of that sort of activity, what we would call logic and accuracy testing, happening at their state. And a similar percentage said that they were aware of chain of custody requirements for ballots or post-election audits. So these are high-profile things that election officials talk a lot about, and respondents on the whole don't know about them. At the same time, when we ask respondents, well, if you knew that your state or locality were doing this, would this reassure you? And by and large, the answer is yes. They like these things when we describe what they are to them. The two items that they are less reassured by are, first of all, being told that that the state is working with the National Guard to do wargaming around cyber threats to voting systems. And the least popular security measure is allowing partisan poll workers to, or rather, allowing partisan poll watchers in the polls. They like nonpartisan poll watchers. They don't like partisan poll watchers. So to wrap up, let me just say a few words about accessing the data, and then I'll be happy to take any questions that y'all might have. The data are on the Harvard Dataverse and the SPAE data site. You can take a picture of the QR code and go right to the site. We have not only 2024, but every past year. If you go to that site, you will see the questionnaire, the YouGov documentation we received back, which describes the methodology in a little bit of detail. They delivered an SPSS data file. We converted it to a Stata data file because I'm old school, I'll use Stata, but you can also get a tab delimited and an R data file to download directly. There's a Stata produced code book to allow you to just see what the marginals are for every item in the survey. The how we voted in 2024 report is there. If you don't get it from the Metso website, you can get it from the Dataverse. And then finally, I should note, we also have the respondents' participation validated against voter files. That work is being done right now. I anticipate in the next month or two, we will get an updated file that will have a code that records whether the respondents in fact voted in the 24 election. And so you don't have to rely on the self-reports of whether they voted. The one kind of methodological point I'll make, and this will be my last slide, is that for those of you who will be taking the data and downloading it and analyzing it yourself, there are two survey weights. There is a survey weight called weight stacked. And what that allows you to do is to get the demographics right for each state on its own. So if you're comparing across states, that's the analysis you're doing, or just looking at a specific state like Massachusetts or Alabama, you want to use weight stacked. If what you're interested in is a nationwide look, for instance, trying to find the average wait time to vote nationwide, then you should use the weight underscore final sampling weight. That will take into account not only demographics, but will also take into account that we have an equal number of Californians and Wyomingites in the survey, and we need to upweight the Californians and downweight the Wyomingites in order to give us valid and reliable national averages. So I will end there. I encourage y'all to ask any questions, put them in the Q&A. If you have any questions after this, feel free to email me at cstewart@mit.edu. I imagine many people on the call today will do the analysis themselves. If you individually or your organization is not set up to do analysis and you're interested in getting some quick and fast and dirty answers, contact me and we can run the numbers for you. The final thing I'll mention is that in past years, I have given a talk to state election meetings of local administrators. I've given about a dozen talks where I package these findings, both the nationwide findings and then what's going on in that particular state. And if you are a local or a state election official and would like me to come out to your state and talk about these numbers and how they apply to you all, that's one of my favorite things to do in all the world, is to give talks to state associations. And so please email me and invite me out. I love talking about this stuff. And so with that, I'm going to stop the share and see where we are with respect to any questions that we have, and go from there. So I'm just going to quickly, and I'll ask Claire if there's anything that needs to be addressed immediately. Otherwise, I'll just start at the top and go down to the bottom. The first question, have I studied my data against the eaves out this month? No, we haven't. One of the things that should be said is that we do some cross-validation of our answers against some of the eaves statistics. The eaves statistics really are, this is the Election Administration and Voting Survey, which is published by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. That's really a census of election administration from the perspective of election administrators. The SPAE is the election from the perspective of the voters. Now, there are times when we put the two data sets together. For instance, we can put attitudes about, say, we can put, for instance, average wait times might be a good example that we have, and we can put that against the eaves data having to do with, say, the number of polling places or the ratio of poll workers to polling places, things like that. But the main answer is that the two surveys really complement each other, and rather than being directly kind of put up against each other. Information about voter purges, list maintenance, etc. Those sorts of questions really are best addressed to the EVES data set. What we, again, the SPAE survey really is about the voter experience. What we discover is that the registered people who went to the polls do not report a large number of problems when they go to the polls. Now, this doesn't mean that there were no problems, right? Because a lot of times voters may have good experiences and they're not aware of maybe a problem that might happen. For instance, if there's something with your ballot such that the results don't scan, right? Your ballot doesn't scan and you're not warned about that, you could have a great experience at the polling place and yet your ballot wasn't counted. And so what I encourage people to do is to use our survey, to use administrative data, to use the EVES data to try to triangulate in to the various issues that we care about in election administration. Yes, the comment from Mary Lynn Pinkerman. Virginia had a period of time when they would provide photo ID if someone did not have one for voting purposes. Interesting. I'll have to look. I can look that one up. How do I connect with and choose survey respondents? I talked a little bit about this. The respondents are through YouGov, and I won't speak for them, but just very quickly, YouGov is a survey research firm. They are one of the major national firms. They've been in business now for close to 2 decades under different names in the U.S. They are an internet survey firm primarily. They recruit people into a panel, and if you get into YouGov panel, and I've actually been in the YouGov panel just to see how it operates. You get asked to fill out surveys and you respond to them. Because the panel is used a lot, if you get into the panel, you are subject to a lot of requests to do surveys. They end up knowing a lot about the respondents. One of the things that YouGov is particularly good at is figuring out whether they're talking to a person as opposed to getting the response from a bot, which is an increasing problem in internet surveys these days. So I'd encourage you, if you want to know more about YouGov, and I may maybe call them YouTube at some point, but YouGov, go to their website, look at their methodology page. I'm more than happy to talk about that offline. What implications of real IDs will have on future elections and voting protocols? Man, that's a big question. I think so the idea is that there's a couple of issues there about real IDs that we don't get at the SPAE, but very quickly, I think there's a misperception that the real ID codes whether you are a citizen or not, which it doesn't. There's only a couple of states that have IDs that actually code for citizenship. And so one of the things that I think we're going to have to look out for is the degree to which people, if they have to prove citizenship in order to vote, how that interacts with real IDs, which are not proofs of citizenship. And so I should note, by the way, that the SPAE does ask people whether they have access, whether would they have direct access to a birth certificate. And so that's something, if people are interested in this issue and issues of proof of citizenship, you can get from the SPAE. And we've asked that question in past years, so you can see how that's tracked over time. Thanks to Karen Brinson Bell about the free voter ID that's created by the Elections Office. Yes. Do I have any? This is what I'm going to mispronounce the first name. Last name is Silverman. Do you have Do you all have any information on what states allow individuals to challenge voter eligibility beyond Georgia, and how bomb threats interrupted polling stations? On challenges off the top of my head, I don't. I would go to the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is generally a really good source for state laws of this sort. As I understand it, every state has some way of challenging individual voter eligibility. The question is whether you can do it in bulk, and I would have to look that up. But I would go to NCSL on that. About bomb threats interrupting polling stations, we do have a question in the survey that I didn't talk about. It's a battery of issues where we ask people if they observed various disruptions or things that are not quite disruptions but are of interest. So for instance, did you observe somebody who is not a police officer carrying a gun? Did you observe somebody who is not a reporter taking pictures? Did you observe people talking loudly, arguing with election officials, challenging people to vote? And we ask about what people observed both in the polling place and outside the polling place. And we also ask the question, um, 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 a similar question among people who dropped off their ballot at a drop box. I can report that there was very few reports of these sorts of disruptions. The type of things that people did most commonly reported were kind of arguments with poll workers and and people questioning the eligibility of people to vote outside the polling place. But again, they were relatively rare. And I haven't gone diving into the responses yet to see if they're, for instance, geographic patterns or racial patterns and those sorts of things that we can distill. What I just said, by the way, I should note that one of the values of the SPAE is that not only do we have these responses, not only do we know the states that people were from, we know what county they lived in, we know their zip code, we know their race, their gender, and their party identification, education, kind of standard demographics. So for people interested in those sorts of demographic issues, we have that data that can be linked to the answers, to the more substantive answers. We do not ask people who they voted for, but we do ask for their party identification, which, as you know, is a pretty good proxy for who people voted for. Are there any other questions? And if not, I will turn it back over to Claire to talk us out.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate that. Thank you for the deep dive. Thanks to everyone who attended, who came and asked questions or just absorbed all the information. Again, we will be making a recording of this webinar available. It will probably be up on our website tomorrow. It will be available on the page that we maintain for the survey. You'll also get an email thanking you for attending, and with the link directly to that page right there. And I think that is all. And with that, thanks for joining us. Hope you have a great day.